Haven't said anything controversial. Lovely. So welcome to this RAF Museum talk. Sorry for the slight delay. This talk is Italo Balbo and the Regia Aeronautica by Dr. John Peaty. So my name is Sam Hollins, and I'm a PhD student collaborating with the RAF Museum, and I'll be introducing John today. So Dr. John Peaty is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and the Royal Historical Society. He holds a PhD and an MA in War Studies from King's College London, where he also attended the Intelligence Studies programme. John served for many years on the committee of the British Commission for Military History in the post of International Secretary. He's a founding member of the Royal Air Force Historical Society, the chair of the Templar Medal Book Prize, and a council member of the Society for Army Historical Research, the convener of the Historical Military Mapping Group, and a council member of the British Cartographic Society, a committee member of the Royal Engineers Historical Society, a member of the National Army Museum's Research and Collections Advisory Panel, and a life member of the University of London's Institute of Historical Research. John has lectured widely to both specialists and non-specialist audiences, both in the UK and overseas. He has published articles, chapters, and essays. He worked at the Ministry of Defence for many years, including at the Army Historical Branch, the Defence Evaluation and Research Agency, and the Defence Intelligence. He was closely involved with the British Army's commemoration of the centenary of the First World War. He has guided both military and civilian groups around battlefields across the globe. So today, this presentation from John will examine the Regia Aeronautica, Italy's Royal Air Force, under the leadership of Italo Balbo in the years 1926 to 1933. So all welcome, John Peaty.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Sam. It was during the years 1926 to 1933 that Balbo's inspiring, dynamic, and energetic leadership developed the fledgling Italian Air Force and made it famous throughout the world. Later events were to overshadow this period, but these years were indeed the golden age of the Italian Air Force. It is a sad fact that remarkable achievements of Italian designers, pilots, manufacturers, theorists, etc., in these years, which were so admired around the world, not least in the UK and US, have been mostly forgotten. I will touch on some subjects tonight. Balbo's audacious mass formation long-distance flights across the Atlantic, the record-breaking successes of Italian pilots and aircraft, not least in the Schneider Trophy contests, and the great technical achievements of Italy's aircraft designers and manufacturers, most notably Caproni heavy bombers, Savoia Marchetti flying boats, and Macchi racers. This talk is derived from research undertaken both in the UK and in Italy over many years. And I'd like to thank the RAF Museum and Harry Raphael for the opportunity to give this talk. Born in 1896 in Ferrara, after serving with the Alpini with distinction in the Great War and reaching the rank of captain, Balbo became a fascist. The youngest and most dynamic of Mussolini's 4 lieutenants, he helped plan and lead the fascist takeover of Italy in 1922. In 1923, the Italian Air Force was created, and 3 years later, Balbo was given the task of developing the fledgling Air Force and bringing it to maturity. Balbo not only did this, but played the leading role in popularizing aviation in Italy and promoting Italian aviation to the world. The Regia Aeronautica was the world's second independent air force. The fascist regime exalted its propaganda possibilities. The repeated search for records and the transoceanic flights were signs of the superiority of Italian men and machines and had a significant impact on the image of Italy around the world. The 20s were a time of great interest in aviation throughout the world, and in Italy in particular. The futurists and the fascists were attracted to the speed, the ingenuity and the modernity that aviation represented. In 1925, De Pinedo flew a seaplane from Italy to Australia to Japan and back to Italy. In 1927, he flew a seaplane from Italy to West Africa, to South America, to North America, and back to Italy. The 4 continents flight. De Bernardi won the Schneider Trophy contest in 1926, and in 1926 and 1928, Nobile commanded airships on Arctic explorations. In November 1926, although he had little experience of aviation, Balbo was appointed Under Secretary of State at the Ministry of Aeronautics, of which Mussolini himself was minister. The first thing Balbo did on his appointment was to take a quick course and learn how to fly. He obtained his pilot's license in 1927. He prepared to organize the newly established Italian Air Force as a truly autonomous and powerful military arm. He faced huge challenges as the Regia Aeronautica was still in its infancy, with insufficient budgets, in need of modernization and an increase in prestige. With Balbo's appointment, Mussolini obtained the opportunity to make aviation a propaganda weapon as well, supporting those in the fascist party who wanted an exponent of fascism to lead the Air Force, also placing the most independently minded of his 4 lieutenants under his direct control. Balbo gave the ministry a permanent home by having a new building built in the fascist neo-Roman style. It had no provision for sitting down to lunch, to discourage long lunches and encourage work. Under the patronage of Balbo and the command of Guidoni, the Barbieri Air Base became the meeting place for pilots, technicians and engineers who were able to exchange information and experiences that contributed to the development of aeronautical studies and made the name of Barbieri famous throughout the world, a centre for cutting-edge aeronautical research. After Guidoni's untimely death, Barbieri was renamed Guidonia. Balbo also created the high-speed experimental unit on Lake Garda, where D'Annunzio's private seaplane base once stood. The director, Bernasconi, had all kinds of facilities and equipment at his disposal to deliver the coveted Schneider Trophy to Italy. I will defer discussion of the Schneider until a bit later. After the success of the air cruise of the Western Mediterranean in 1928, which he organized together with De Pinedo, Balbo was made a general of the air. This provoked the resentment of De Pinedo, who rightly saw himself as the true architect of the enterprise. The next air cruise of the Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea in 1929 was also led by Balbo. Relations between Balbo and De Pinedo became strained. In September 1929, at the age of only 33, Balbo was promoted to the post of Minister of the Air, a position held until then by Mussolini himself. De Pinedo was immediately posted to Argentina. In these years, Balbo was rich, powerful and famous, exuberant and enthusiastic, with friendships in the world of culture and industry. In 1932, Balbo proposed to Mussolini the establishment of a single Ministry of Defence in place of the 3 service ministries, supported by quadrupling the sums allocated to the Navy and Air Force, Balbo himself being at the helm of the new ministry. The proposal was rejected. Balbo commanded two audacious and headline-making transatlantic flights. The first was the flight from Italy to Brazil and back in 1930-31. The second was the flight from Italy to the US and back in 1933. The idea for an overseas air cruise came to his mind during an international aero congress in the US. He became convinced that the first group of planes to cross the Atlantic in formation would go down in history. In 1929, he persuaded the engineer Marchetti to develop the Savoia Marchetti S-55 flying boat to equip a special squadron. It was decided to cross the South Atlantic with 12 aircraft, and the Regia Marina would provide support of 5 destroyers. The flying boats left in December 1930, personally led by Balbo, and in January 1931, they reached Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and then flew back to Italy. I will just defer discussion of the much more spectacular and much more successful transoceanic flight to the US and back until a little later. When Balbo returned from the US in August 1933, he was promoted by Mussolini to the newly created rank of Marshal of the Air at the age of 37. No other man in the history of the Italian Air Force has held such rank. Beyond these extraordinary feats, Balbo deployed great energy in imposing discipline and rigor on the Italian Air Force, setting aside the romantic and individualistic aspects of pioneering aviation and directing it rather to form a cohesive and disciplined armed force. The transoceanic flights in formation were an example of this approach. No longer individual enterprises, but group activities, carefully planned in studies. In doing so, however, he gave too much weight to spectacular events, inducing the Air Force to give too much attention to sporting records without positive repercussions on the planes used for normal service. However, the prestige attained by aviation during Balbo's ministry gave the Italian government and people, as well as friends and potential adversaries, the impression that Italy possessed a first-rate air force. While Balbo endorsed Douai's ideas on strategic aviation, he never gave Douai a post. At the same time, he actively supported the creation of the assault wing under the command of Mecozzi, encouraging the development of tactical aviation. So he never gave the Air Force a real doctrine of war. He was not able to impose his will on the heads of the Army and Navy, as well as on industrialists who wished to win the highest number of orders to expand the already heterogeneous fleet of aircraft. The Aeronautical magazine, founded in 1925, under Balbo, became closely controlled by him, and he examined and approved the content of every issue. It, the Revista Aeronautica, published pieces both by Douai and by his critics, including Mecozzi. Balbo opposed the concession of bombers to the Regia Marina and the construction of aircraft carriers for funding reasons. The failure to build aircraft carriers had a negative impact on the operations of the Italian Navy during the Second World War, but it would be a mistake to attribute the responsibility solely to Balbo's opposition, given the conservative position of the Italian admirals. Balbo put forward the idea for a reorganized Italian army, much smaller, but much more modern and effective. But for propaganda purposes, the idea did not find favor with Mussolini, nor, naturally enough, with the generals. Having achieved enormous popularity both in home and abroad, and considered politically as a serious rival of Mussolini, the regime decreed that Balbo's name was not to appear more than once a month in newspapers. In November 1933, after exactly 7 years at the Air Ministry, Balbo was replaced as Air Minister and Mussolini took up the post again, sending Balbo to govern a rebellious Libya. It has been said that Balbo was replaced and exiled because Mussolini was jealous and wary of him. Undoubtedly, Balbo enjoyed huge popularity and massive prestige after his transatlantic flights. It has been said that Mussolini disliked Balbo's proposals for a smaller army and a reorganization of defense. It has also been said that Mussolini wanted Balbo out of the way because of his hostility to both Germany and to anti-Semitism. Hitler, an admirer of Mussolini, having come to power early in 1933. Indeed, Balbo was the only leading fascist to oppose Mussolini's turning away from Britain and France and the forming of an alliance with Nazi Germany. Balbo remained in Libya until his death in June 1940 from friendly fire just after Italy had entered the war. After his death, Mussolini said, "A handsome Alpini, a great aviator, a true revolutionary, the only one who would have been able to kill me." For many, many years, rumors persisted that Balbo's death was, in fact, an assassination. Foreign Minister Ciano noted in his diary, "Balbo did not deserve this end. He was exuberant, restless. He loved life in all its manifestations. He had not wanted war and had opposed it to the end. The memory of Balbo will remain for a long time among the Italians because he was, above all, an Italian with the great defects and great qualities of our breed." Sadly, memory of the remarkable Balbo and his amazing achievements in the air has faded, even in Italy. The standard life in English of Balbo remains that of Claudio Segre, published as long ago as 1990 and seriously out of date. So let me now turn to the most famous and spectacular of Balbo's achievements, the flight across the North Atlantic. The press in the US christened him the Columbus of the air. His flight in 1933 caused a sensation. He appeared on the front cover of Time. The decennial air cruise was to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Italian Air Force. And from the 1st of July to the 12th of August 1933, 12 S-55 flying boats flew a round trip from Rome to the Century of Progress in Chicago. The flight took them via Amsterdam, Londonderry, Reykjavik, Cartwright, Shediac, Montreal, ending on Lake Michigan. In honor of this feat, Mussolini donated an ancient Roman column from Ostia to the city of Chicago. Chicago named a street in the center of the city Balbo Drive and staged a great parade in his honor. Thus far, campaigns by some to remove the monument and rename the street have failed. From Chicago, they flew to New York City with an escort of US warplanes. Millions of people watched the parade of dozens of cars escorted by police horses along the streets of Manhattan as ticker tape was thrown from the offices above. During Balbo's stay in the US, President Roosevelt invited him to lunch and presented him with the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was awarded the 1931 Harmon Trophy, and the Sioux adopted Balbo as Chief Flying Eagle. The term Balbo entered common usage to describe any large formation of aircraft and the type of beard that Balbo wore. The return flight from New York stopped in Newfoundland, then proceeded back to Rome via the Azores and Lisbon. While many have given their name to a type of facial hair, have entered aeronautical dictionaries, have graced the front cover of Time, have been accorded a ticker tape parade through the streets of New York, have been made an honorary Red Indian, have had streets named after them, have had monuments erected in their honor. Only Balbo has achieved the ultimate distinction, being parodied by the Marx Brothers in their 1935 film, A Night at the Opera. Fame indeed. So let me turn to the Schneider Trophy seaplane races that were held initially every year and then every 2 years, except for the war years between 1913 and 1931. The 1919 race was won by Italy, so the 20 race was held in Venice. Italy having won again in 1921, the race was also held in Venice. Italy having won again, its third consecutive win, but the 1919 contest having been controversially declared null and void, the 2020 race was held in Naples. Italy won the 1926 race in the US. So the 1927 race was held in Venice, hosted by Balbo and organized by Adriani. But Italy did not win. Britain won. Held in Britain and attended by Balbo, Britain won again in 1929. At the end of the banquet, Balbo made it clear that they were going to go all out to win the 1931 race. Held in Britain. But in 1931, Britain alone raced and won the trophy outright. No other country participated. Let me now look at some of the extraordinary aircraft designed and built in Italy under Balbo's patronage. The chief designer of Savoia Marchetti was Marchetti. The S-55 was a remarkable design because of its unorthodox configuration. It was a twin-hulled flying boat with an open cockpit, very thick wings, twin engines installed back to back and canted at a striking angle, and a tailplane carried on wire-braced booms. In 1926, S-55 set up 14 world records for speed, altitude, and distance with payload. The use of the aircraft in the North and South Atlantic cruises amply demonstrated its quality. The aircraft designer and manufacturer Count Gianni Caproni was a disciple of Douay, friend, supporter, collaborator, and advocate of his ideas, both during and after the Great War. Caproni designed and built a series of long-range multiple-engine bombers during the Great War, which the Italians used to mount a strategic bombing campaign against Austria. He developed more powerful models which were operated by Italian, French, British, and American forces. And his Caproni 5 of 1917 was the best Allied bomber that saw service during the war, with more engine power, higher ceiling, and bigger payload than the Handley Page 0400. The final models of his wartime bombers remained in service well into the 1920s. The CA-90, Caproni 90 of 1929, was the world's largest aircraft. With 6 engines and 2 wings, the lower with a span of 152 feet 11 inches, it could carry 18,000 pounds of bombs. A bomb load that was not exceeded until the middle of the Second World War, and it had a range of 800 miles. Only one was built. In 1929, the world was at peace and there were no obvious enemies. And after this, the Caproni 90, Caproni concentrated on medium bombers, and these did go into production. The chief designer at Fiat was Rosatelli. He was responsible for a series of biplane fighters, including the CR-20, which was the frontline fighter during Balbo's tenure, and it equipped Italy's first acrobatic flight school, founded in Udine in 1930. It was superseded by the CR-30 and then by the CR-32, which first flew in April 1933. All were maneuverable and fast. Italy's first monoplane fighter, the Freccia or Arrow, did not fly until February 1937. If Balbo had remained as Air Minister after November 1933, I find it hard to believe that Italy's first monoplane fighter would not have appeared at the same time as the Hurricane, which first flew in November 35, or the Spitfire, which first flew in March 36, or even earlier. It is also hard to believe that had Balbo remained in post, the Italian Air Force would have continued with biplane fighters. While criticism may fairly be made of Italy's adherence to the biplane fighter, long past the point when it ought to have switched to monoplane fighters, we perhaps should remember that the RAF's last biplane fighter, the Gloucester Gladiator, did not enter service until February 1937. But the most incredible of the aircraft developed under Balbo were undoubtedly the Macchi racers designed to win the Schneider Trophy, pushing the boundaries of technology. They were designed by Castoldi. It won the 1926 competition with the M39 with a speed of 246 miles an hour. The M52 was designed for the 1927 competition in Venice. 3 were built and entered, but all 3 developed engine trouble and did not finish. Between competitions in 1928, flying an improved version, the M52R, De Bernardi reached a speed of 318 miles per hour. The M67 was designed for the 1920 competition and 3 were built. However, 1 crashed in training, so 2 M67 and 1 M52R took part in the race. The M67s did not finish, while the M52R took 2nd place. Very different, that's the M67. Very different from and far superior to his previous designs, the Macchi Custodi MC-72 can reasonably claim to be the most extraordinary aircraft designed for the Schneider and the most extraordinary seaplane ever, although it was not completed in time to compete in 1931. It had a pair of V12 Fiat engines mounted back-to-back in tandem, driving a pair of contra-rotating propellers. This solved the outstanding problem which had plagued other Schneider designers, the effects of torque when their throttles were open for takeoff. The controllable pitch propeller had not yet been perfected, and the Schneider racers had enormous fixed pitch propellers of exceedingly coarse pitch. When the throttle was first opened and before the craft had gathered forward speed, one float would dig in and try to turn the machine in a circle. This was also the moment when the spray was worst, preventing the pilot from seeing where he was going. So not a happy situation. There was no such problem with the MC-72, which could make a straight takeoff run under full control the whole time, because the contra-rotating propellers were free from torque. 4 MC-72s were built, 3 crashing and killing their pilots, but the 4th, piloted by Agello, set several remarkable speed records in 1933 and 1934, culminating with a speed of 440 mph in October 1934, by which time the aeroplane's double engine was developing more than 3,000 horsepower. This remained an outright world speed record until 1939 and a seaplane record until 1961. Developed from the Macchi racers, as the Spitfire was developed from the Supermarine seaplane racers in Britain, the Macchi monoplane fighters were impressive designs, but sadly underpowered. Custodi preferred inline power plants, as in his racers, but in the early 30s, the development of radial engines was encouraged in Italy. The first of the fighters, the Lightning, did not fly until December 1937, and its engine developed a mere 28% of the power developed by the MC-72, giving it a top speed of only 312 miles per hour. Balbo and Italian airmen enjoyed close and warm relations with their British counterparts. This was based upon shared wartime service and furthered by Balbo's transatlantic flights and the Schneider Trophy contests. Moreover, the Regia Aeronautica was the only other independent air force in the world and only 5 years younger than the RAF. Samuel Hoare, who was Secretary of State for Air for most of the 20s and the RAF's favourite uncle, wrote in his memoirs, "In the 20s, we in the Air Ministry were especially interested in the Italian Air Force, the only other independent air force in the world beside our own. Balbo, in fact, was my sole colleague in the world as Air Minister. Mussolini was then our ally, and we had always maintained a close and friendly contact from the start with Italian aviation. Hoare, following his wartime service in Italy, was a convinced Italophile. He was concerned not only to maintain but also to expand the long-standing ties between British and Italian aviation. He visited several times during the mid-20s, meeting Mussolini in 1925, who thanked him for helping the nascent fascist party, and again at Balbo's invitation in 1929. Balbo, an equally convinced Anglophile, led a tour of Britain in 1927. Warmly received by Hoare and Trenchard, they were feted everywhere they went. They visited Hendon, Cranwell, the Royal Aeronautical Society, and the factories of leading manufacturers. Balbo returned to Britain in each of the 3 succeeding years. Hendon in 1928, the Schneider Trophy contest on the Solent in 1929, and London in 1930. On their way to Hendon in 1928, Balbo led a formation of 11 aircraft non-stop from Rome to the new Hornchurch Aerodrome. The formation was met over the Essex coast by British fighters and escorted to the aerodrome. There is no doubt that Balbo and the Italian Air Force were highly respected in Britain. Trenchard, the father of the RAF, who was Chief of Staff for most of the 20s, in his famous and controversial memorandum, The War Object of an Air Force, in May 1928, in which he first openly argued the case for an independent strategy in the future war, referred to foreign thinkers. He didn't specify who those foreign thinkers were, but a member of the air staff, MacNeese Foster, did. He was quoting from a powerfully Duettian speech on the subject of objectives in time of war that had been reported in Britain 3 years earlier. That speech had been given by Andriani, who had helped Balbo organize the Schneider Trophy contest in Venice and was one of the Italian Air Force most senior officers. Upon hearing of Balbo's death, just after Italy entered the war, the C&C of the RAF in the Middle East ordered an aircraft to fly over the airfield where it had occurred to drop a wreath and a note of condolence. The British Royal Air Force expresses its sympathy in the death of General Balbo, a great leader and gallant aviator, professionally known to me, whom fate has placed on the other side. Signed, Arthur Longmore. There is no doubt that while many in Britain greatly admired and respected Mussolini, Balbo, fascism, and the Italian Air Force in the 20s and 30s, as soon as Italy entered the war as Hitler's only ally and against Britain and France, such respect and admiration became an embarrassment, best forgotten and quickly. So, to conclude, under Balbo, the Italian Air Force had become one of the largest, most modern and most powerful air forces in the world. Italian aviation was held in high esteem throughout the world in the period from the mid-20s to the mid-30s, due to the personal magnetism of the intrepid and courageous Balbo, the audacity of his long-distance mass formation flights, It's interesting to note that the term Balbo was in standard use by the RAF for a mass formation of aircraft during the Battle of Britain. And there was the record-breaking successes of Italian pilots and aeroplanes, not least in the Schneider Trophy, and the great technical achievements of Italy's designers and manufacturers. Under Balbo, the Italian Air Force never before and never again stood so high. Its achievements were admired throughout the world. The Balbo years were indeed the golden years of the Italian Air Force. Under the dashing, daring and photogenic Balbo, the Italian Air Force was the pride of Italy, respected by friends and feared by potential foes. It is true that there was often more style than substance, more appearance than reality, more emphasis on headline making and record breaking prototypes than on mass production models. It's also true that the Italian Air Force was not ready for World War when Balbo ceased to lead it in 1933. But the Italian Air Force was only 3 years old when Balbo was appointed, and by 1933 he had greatly raised its standings and laid the necessary foundation on which others could build. Which country and which air force was ready for World War in 1933? The answer, none. The 4-engine heavy bomber, the monoplane fighter and radar all lay in the future. So finally, I would conclude by saying that the removal of Balbo and his exile to Africa in 1933 was a tragedy. It was a tragedy for the Italian Air Force, and it was a tragedy for Italy as a whole. Had Balbo remained at the Air Ministry and at the centre of decision-making in Italy, it is difficult to believe that Italy would have turned away from Britain and France and thrown in its lot with Germany in 1940. It's also difficult to believe that the Italian Air Force would have been so unprepared for the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was a fantastic talk. We've got a few questions of my own. So anyone in here with us or anybody online, if you let us know that you want to ask a question and I'll read them out and we'll get started. So online, a question has been asked: how did Balbo integrate the views and needs of the Italian aviation industry?
Balbo did not have control over the Italian aviation industry. And there was a multiplicity of manufacturers, designers. I mentioned only a few. Savoia Marchetti, he was able to influence. Macchi, he was able to influence. Caproni, Fiat, but there were also Piaggio, Kant, Breda. So there was no control over the Italian aviation industry. It wasn't centralized, it wasn't rationalized. But I think that was the same the world over. There were private companies with their own private developments, their own private designs, each pushing for their particular pet project. And I don't think this was peculiar to Italy. But yes, he was not able to rationalize the Italian industry. Whether would have been able to do that if he'd remained in post after 1933, who knows? it may well have happened.
During the talk, you mentioned that Balbo was directly opposed to anti-Semitism. Is there a particular reason for that?
No. A lot of Italians were opposed to anti-Semitism. It was only the axis with Germany that led to the passing of anti-Semitic laws in Italy. Yeah. But there was not the visceral anti-Semitism in Italy that there was in other places, not only in Germany. I don't think there was any particular personal issue. I just think that he was not anti-Semitic, as were many Italians not anti-Semitic. He was very much an Anglophile and very much pro-American.
Interesting. Harry has a question.
Hi, John. I really enjoyed the talk. I thought my favourite part was when you mentioned that he designed the Air Ministry without the ability to take long lunches. I think that's, it's a really fascinating insight because, of course, he must have been striving to shape the culture within the Italian Air Force. And so really, I think the question I have for you is how successfully did he do that? And was it long lasting? And so when he goes in 33, has he had enough success in that short time he's been there to drive that culture forward long term, or is it dissipated by his successor?
Well, yes, he was at the Air Ministry 7 years, but of course he was only in charge for the last 4 of those years, because up to that point Mussolini was nominally Minister for Air. It sounds a long time, but it's actually not long enough to change a culture. Yes, not being able to have a long lunch was a very revolutionary, radical idea, especially in a Mediterranean, a hot country, where people dine late and long. So I don't think he was able to change that culture. I think he was, with his mass formation flights, I think he was able to change the culture a bit. The feud with Di Pinedo and his exiling to Argentina was, I think, an attempt to say, we have to think big, we have to think in terms of groups and formations, rather than the First World War aces. But again, I don't think he had much permanent effect, because I think a lot of these things reverted after he went in 1933. And again, it's not a dodge, it's a genuine thought. If he'd have been given another 7 years, things may have been different. But certainly a lot of things reverted. A lot of inefficiencies, a lot of impetus was lost, a lot of momentum was lost. And we really don't know what would have happened if he'd have stayed after 1933.
Yeah, there's another question online. T asks, was aviation, such as the Snyder Trophy planes, so were they used to develop technologies such as engines and also help develop better warplanes, even indirectly, as in the UK? And I kind of had a corollary to that, which would be, how exactly were race planes funded? Was it seen as a way of promoting development for military aviation, or was it purely for the theatrics and the prestige?
In the 20s, certainly, it was viewed in Italy and by Balbo as a means of raising the prestige of Italian aviation and bonusing off of technical developments, designs for military purposes. And the competition between Britain, France, the US, and Italy became very, very fierce. And first the French dropped out, then the Americans, and it was basically left to the British and Italians. And then eventually the Italians dropped out as well. So we won the Snyder Trophy in 1931 by taking part in a one-horse race, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that, being British. But yes, in Britain, of course, famously, the Supermarine Spitfire can be traced back to the races on the Solent. As I mentioned, the Macchi racers were developed later into the Macchi fighters, which progressively got better in the 30s and during the Second World War. They went through various iterations: Lightning, Thunderbolt, Greyhound, etc. But the issue that they had was that they went down the wrong path. They went down the path of radial engines. Yeah. Whether you could have a fighter with a 3,000 horsepower contra-rotating propeller, I don't know. It would have been the most incredible fighter. As I said, it was still the fastest aircraft in the world in 1939 and the fastest seaplane until a Russian jet in 1961. Whether that would have been a practical fighter or not, I don't know, but it was certainly the basis for the development of Italian monoplane fighters by Macchi. But the engines were underpowered, and eventually during the Second World War, they only caught back up with us and the Spitfire when they imported Daimler-Benz engines. And the final model of the final models of the Macchi fighters were easily the equal, if not superior, to the later marks of the Spitfire.
It's interesting, you talk about the radial engines, and it's something from the automotive industry as well. I know, for instance, that Mazda developed and were leaning into radial engines, and that, jumped back to bite them because radial engines were so unreliable. When they were working and on point, the power delivery was exceptional, and they were incredibly light, but also incredibly temperamental. So it's interesting that the Italian aviation industry lent so hard into radial engines. Did they view it to be like the future of engines, or was there a particular reason they lent into radial engines?
I think it was a wrong turning. Mm-hmm. It was a punt. It could have paid off, yeah. And it didn't.
Yeah.
I think they were slightly, as I said, challenged by the possibilities of converting a contra-rotating 3,000 horsepower inline engine into a practical fighter.
Yeah.
But I think they took a wrong turning. Obviously, Italy had a huge automotive industry, Fiat and etc. And it was a choice that didn't pay off.
Yeah.
And they caught up too late, as I said, by importing German engines.
Questions? We've got a question. We've got a question from the crowd, so just say who you are and then ask your question.
My name's Tom. Thanks very much for the talk. I just kind of wanted to ask about doctrine in Italy, sort of air war doctrine, and was there any real view on Balbo's part about what the mission of the Italian Air Force would be? And I know, this there was a huge emphasis on bombers and countering bombers in the 30s and just before the Second World War. And then, was there any notion that air superiority or air defense was the main role of the Italian Air Force? Or was there a notion that maybe it would be used for sort of colonial efforts? Or was he just mainly interested in sort of the kind of adventurous side of what you could do to build prestige? Thanks very much.
Well, I think the criticism can be made, and I made it, that there was an obsession with one-off prototypes, with spectacular, with style over substance, appearance rather than reality. But that was all to do to create an air-mindedness, to create a political support, public support, and hopefully financial support. In terms of doctrine, well, as I said, he endorsed both Douai and Mokotsi, and they are diametrically opposed. One is strategic bombing, one is tactical air support. So he backed both horses. There was not a single doctrine of war. By the time he left the Air Ministry in 1933, the international situation had darkened, but world war was not imminent. There was no obvious great power enemy to Italy. Italy did have colonies and was keen to acquire more. So there was always a colonial element to Italian design and procurement. And a lot of the Caproni medium bombers designed in the 30s went into production and were used in colonial warfare. Would there had been more focus? Would there have been more clearer doctrine laid down if Balbo had stayed in place? I just don't know. When you have two incredible air theorists who just, Douai and Mokotsi, who are diametrically opposed, they are as far apart as you possibly can be, and yet they're given even space, they're given even recognition. You could call it backing two horses, but so Balbo did not come down on one side or the other. He never said, we're a tactical air force or a strategic air force. We are both. With the coming of war, with the darkening of the scene in the mid and later 30s, whoever was in charge would have had to have, you would have hoped, more come to a greater focus on doctrine, on types of aircraft that could be mass produced. One would have hoped, but the Italian Air Force does not appear to have done that between 1933 and 1940. So those cultural problems that we talked about earlier were really, really ingrained.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. So I think it's it's not a simple question, but it's a nice short question. Addy Osborne asks, in your personal opinion, was Balbo assassinated?
Well, Samuel Hoare thought he was assassinated. He thought he was removed by Mussolini, but I don't think there is enough evidence to substantiate that. I think it was a friendly fire incident. A few days after Italy's entry into the war, everyone was keyed up and trigger happy. But Samuel Hoare certainly believed that to the day he died. It's not inconceivable, but if I was to put money on it, I would say it was a friendly fire accident. And so he died at the age of 43 after cramming in several lifetimes.
Yeah, it's quite young. So that. Do you have a question or?
Yeah, I feel I'm going to channel my Seb Cox here, John. And that's because radial engines, I mean, you've been very harsh on them. It pains me, Sam, that you've agreed with him. But I think if we look at how America are developing engines, in Britain as well, radial engines are being developed. There's a very strong argument to be made that radial engines were a successful line of development. And post-war, the American large aircraft used radial engines very successfully and, of course, capture the civil market. So I wonder, really, are we looking at this the wrong way? We know that they failed to develop successful fighter aircraft, so we see their radial engines as a dead-end development step. But had they gone on to develop an effective bomber with radial engines, of course, radial engines are very good for bombers, and they successfully developed a supercharger for it, so high horsepower as well, might we actually be saying, well, what a smart line of development the Italians took? I mean, is it really that the people who follow on from Balbo, in your opinion, don't necessarily take the right steps to maximize the effectiveness of the Italian industry and air force that he's left when he dies?
Well, I think you make a very good point. I think although I obviously had to step outside the strict period to give some of the background and also some of the legacy, I'm really only speaking to the period 1926 to 1933. You can make a very good argument for radial engines, and I think you make a very valid point. I think that the success of the inline engines, the inline power plants developed by Mario Castoldi for Macchi, was such that I think they probably exerted an enormous influence. And obviously, although the design existed under Balbo, it didn't break and set that incredible world speed record until he'd gone, the following year. And I think that exerted a huge influence. I think, that you can argue it both ways, whether if they'd have persisted with radial engines, if they'd have really gripped the thing between 33 and 40, I think you can make a very strong argument. I think you can also argue that they thought that radial engines were a dead end, and they took the wrong turning. I mean, in defence of the Italians between 33 and 44, between 33 and 40, Balbo was such a hard act to follow. I think I've given some of the flavour of his personality and his dominance. Such a hard act to follow. It's like when Walt Disney died. What are the next films like? Well, we can't ask him, can we? What would Walt have done? Well, what would Italo have done? Because he's in Libya. So you could defend them by saying, well, he was such a hard act to follow that they didn't really progress as much as they should have done. They didn't take the key hard decisions. I'm pretty convinced that if Balbo had continued, he would have been faced with some pretty hard decisions as the scene darkened and as great power war became a likelihood. Whether he liked it or not, he would have made those decisions, right or wrong. But he wasn't there. He was in Libya. Yeah. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but I'm afraid that's the best I can give.
Well, that was excellent. There's been lots of really great feedback online. So I want to say thank you again to Dr. John Peaty for a fascinating talk. I've learned a lot. And it's interesting for me and my own research to learn more about the Italian aviation industry and the Air Force. So thank you. And thank you to the RAF Museum for hosting this event. Thank you for Harry for putting it on. And is there anything else? Yeah, good. Round of applause for John, I'd say.